Hello guys, today we're going to talk about chapter entitled Origin of Species. Basically today we're going to talk about how new species arise and what are the mechanisms that determine the so-called phenomenon of speciation. First of all, before starting, let's take a look and remind ourselves what is a species. Remember that there is a very well-defined concept of species, which is the biological species concept, which refers to a species as a group of organisms having common characteristics and that are capable of breeding, mating with one another and produce fertile offspring. Remember, we talked about this concept at the very beginning of this course. So this is biological species concept is the most used and most reliable concept, but as we will see, there are instances where we cannot actually apply this concept. So today we're going to talk about the phenomenon of speciation, which is the phenomenon through which new species arise. Whenever we talk about speciation, there's one thing that always basically happens in order for new species to arise, which is reproductive isolation. If reproductive isolation happens between groups that may or may not belong to the same species, then we are in front of a phenomenon of speciation. Speciation phenomena happen all the time for many reasons, and the result of this speciation is the reproductive isolation. So what is reproductive isolation? Reproductive isolation refers to the interruption of a gene flow between populations. And there are many examples that we can use for instance, imagine how this phenomenon could happen. Imagine that there is a group of animals or plants living in a certain area at a certain time. Imagine that some catastrophic event happens, maybe a huge movement of the earth crust that divides that very population in two subgroups, and maybe a river appears there. What is going to happen to these two populations of the same species over time? They may start acquiring different feeding habits. The temperature could be different. Behavior could also diversify, and so on. And maybe after many thousands or millions of years, when the two populations come back together, they no longer recognize each other as the same species. They either simply don't mate with one another anymore because they have acquired different behavior. We can say in a very, of course, in a quoted way, they don't like each other anymore, right? Or even if they maybe still mate with one another, they're not able to produce offspring or viable fertile offspring. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what are those, what kind of mechanisms we can recognize regarding the reproductive isolation. And generally speaking, we can talk about two major ways of reproductive isolation. One is known as pre-zygotic and the other is known as post-zygotic. Zygotic, it should ring a bell. Zygotic refers to the zygote. And remember that the zygote is the first cell that appears, a diploid cell, after fertilization of a sperm cell with an egg cell. Okay, so that's the zygote. So pre-zygotic refers to this. If egg and sperm don't fuse, you have a pre-zygotic barrier interruption of possible mating. If it's post-zygotic, it means that somehow egg and sperm have fused, but there are downstream problems that happens to where maybe the zygote does not develop. All right, so let's look at these mechanisms of reproductive isolation, the prezygotic and the postzygotic ones. The prezygotic isolation mechanisms that we can recognize are the temporal, the mechanical, the ecological, the behavioral, and lastly, gamete incompatibility. For the postzygotic, we can recognize hybrid sterility, hybrid inviability, and hybrid breakdown. We're going to talk about those in detail. Let's start with the prezygotic isolation mechanisms. Okay? Temporal, the first one. Temporal refers to the timing of reproduction being different. This can be extreme, or it can be as slight as just a different time of the day or a different season. Extreme cases, for instance, are, as an example, given by species of cicadas, which reproduce every decades. We have several species that reproduce every 17 years, others every 13 years. So for these two cicadas to even meet with one another, possible breed, it would take 221 years if you do the math. These are extreme examples of extreme temporal separation, but as I told you, there are examples that are a little bit minor in terms of timing. For instance, there are species of frogs that breed different seasons, and that defines them as different species, because in fact they don't like to mate with one another, because one likes the spring and other likes the fall. Or sometimes you even have species that like to mate at different time of the day. And so those are all examples of temporal reproductive isolation. I have a couple of videos here that refer to the cicadas, and I invite you to watch them. Especially the first one, I think it's really a nice video. I'm not going to play it right now, okay, because I want to play some other video at the end, okay? So temporal isolation. Mechanical isolation refers to really incompatibility of mainly the reproductive structures, okay? So this is true for plants, it's true also for animals. For instance, let's look at this species of snail. You see, because the sexual organs of a snail are within the shell, if you are a snail with a short disc-like shell, that would be incompatible with the shell of a snail that has a tall cone-shaped form. And so this is mechanical, okay? Incompatibility, some kind of anatomical incompatibility that prevents fertilization, okay? Ecological, third example of reproductive isolation. This can be seen with plants, with animals as well. For instance, here an example of plants that live at different altitudes, and of course because of that they have acquired different niches. In fact, it's quite difficult for them to reproduce because of the pollen not migrating at those distances. So this is an ecological example. We can find these examples also with animals. For instance, we're going to talk about cicadas, a species of fish that do present this kind of ecological isolation. Behavioral refers to isolation because of behavior. This is seen very much in birds. And it's astonishing how you have birds that are pretty much identical, almost identical in terms of genetics, appearance, But in fact, there is a behavioral reproductive isolation, because maybe one is a Western group, another one is an Eastern group, and the females in this regard apply the isolation because they don't recognize the songs of the other group, and therefore they don't mate, they will not mate. And so this is referred to behavioral reproductive isolation. Okay, the last one that we're going to talk about is gamete incompatibility. Now, you know that there are many species of fish and other invertebrates that simply release their gametes into the water, and their gametes just find one another. Now, of course, only gametes, only sperm of a certain species will fertilize eggs of the same species. Okay, so of course a sperm released by a sea urchin will not fertilize the egg released by a certain species of fish. And so this is known as gamete incompatibility, and it refers to simply the molecules that are on the surface of gametes. There must be some molecules on the surface of the head of a sperm and the egg cell that recognize each other and allow for the fusion to happen. Okay, so ultimately this is known as gamete incompatibility. And here as an example, there are many species of in the ocean very similar. This is just a different color. This type is a little bit, this species is a little bit smaller. These are two species of sea urchin. They live very close to one another, but in fact there is gamete incompatibility between these two. And if that wasn't the case, these two species would maintain separated with one another. All right, so we're done with the pre-zygotic mechanisms of reproductive isolation. Now we're going to look at the post-zygotic isolation mechanisms. The first one we're going to talk about is hybrid sterility. I think we also looked at this one at the very beginning. We talked about this. Sometimes species are very close, or so close to that they mate with one another and even produce offspring that is viable. Viable means they can live. But if in fact that hybrid that is produced is sterile, the hybrid does not have an opportunity to perpetuate as a hybrid. So the two species, not only are they maintained separated still, but also there is not going to be perpetuation of the hybrid. And so you know that when a female horse mates with a male donkey, which by the way they have different numbers of chromosomes, this produces a mule, which is a different number of chromosomes than the parent species, and this hybrid is sterile. There are many examples like this. This is not just the only example, it's just the most known. So a mule is a hybrid, a sterile hybrid. Okay, and the fact that this mule, this hybrid is sterile, it's actually due to the fact that this mule has an odd number of chromosomes, and whenever cell division happens to produce gametes, this odd number of chromosomes creates problems to where the cell division doesn't happen correctly. That's what it boils down to. All right, second example of post-zygotic isolation I want to talk about is hybrid inviability. Now, viability as a broad term, it can refer to the fact that an organism cannot live. Viability that lives in viability does not live, but it will also refer to an instance where the organism has low fitness, for instance. It all is indicated as inviability. So it's more generic term That can mean different things depending on the scenario that we are looking at. For instance, let's look at this example. Tigers and leopards that mate together. They can be called tigers or leogers, it depends. And in this case, what happens is that the hybrid is born alive and survives to maturity, but basically does not live long enough life to actually reproduce. Another example here of hybrid inviability is a leopon, which is a hybrid produced by lioness and a leopard. This can also be called a leopard. All these hybrids change name depending on who is the species, the female species, and what is the male species that is actually mating. So in the previous example, we were talking about tigers and leopards. Okay. Examples of these are also ligers. You may be more acquainted with the liger example. Ligers are this kind of hybrids that actually they do, the hybrids actually are fertile, believe it or not, but they have very low fitness, and that's when the fitness here comes into play to explain the inviability. Okay. Leopon has a very short lifespan, not even long enough to reach the age of reproduction, and is also sterile. So, of course, these are impediments to the perpetuation of the hybrid itself. Okay, we just talked about ligers, and here again, when you are mating a male lion and a female tiger, you have a liger. When you switch around the female and the male of the parental species, then you call it in a different way. You call it tigon. The reason for this is that the two hybrids actually do look different. They are different, and this is always true when you mate different species, when different species mate to produce these hybrids. Even for the example of a mule, if you invert the gender of the parental species, you don't obtain a mule, you obtain what is called a hinny. Again, they are quite little bit different hybrids, but generally speaking have the same characteristics. Now, in this case, ligers, you'll read that have been able to reproduce. And first of all, ligers are always obtaining captivity as well as tigons. And so this is not a natural phenomenon of mating. But on top of that, ligers, yes, they've been able to reproduce, but their fitness is very, very low. So you really have to push the system here in order to obtain some offspring, and this is not natural. So in definitive, tigers and lions are different species. You cannot consider them the same species because you have now forced the system enough to where you even have a reproduction of rare reproduction of a rare hybrid. Okay, so all these are again examples of post-zygotic isolation. They're a little bit falling in a gray area here, but they're still examples of post-zygotic reproductive isolation. All right, so the third example of post-zygotic isolation is known as hybrid breakdown. This is mostly observed in plants and refers to the fact that the sterility and the impairment of the hybrid perpetuation is not seen in the first generation, but is seen in the subsequent generation after the first one. So basically, the first hybrid of parental species is fertile and viable in the first generation, but then when this first hybrid reproduces, the offspring will be sterile. So you have a downstream breakdown in this case. This is also an example of post-zygotic isolation. Okay? All right, so this is another one that's pretty interesting. I don't know if you have ever heard about a wolfin. This is a hybrid from a female bottlenose dolphin and a false killer whale. Okay, and these are very rare, very rare. They have been mostly observed in captivity, but I think there have been some instances where they have been observed also in nature. Again, very rare. And I think this hybrid is also fertile to some extent, but again, very low fitness. There is a video you can watch. I don't know if it's still available, this video, but this tells you a little bit about wolfin. Okay. All right. So interesting phenomena. Now, so far we have defined all these phenomena of speciation and maintaining different species separated based on pretty much mating, if you will. But we know that and we know that the biological species concept applies to sexually reproduced species which mate. But what do we do if we cannot apply the biological species concept for one reason or another? For instance, what we do if we are in front of species that reproduce asexually. Many protist species, they do reproduce asexually, and amoeba will reproduce asexually. We have many species of amoebas that we have recognized. So in that regard, we have to apply different species concepts. One of them is the morphological species concept, which classifies organisms based on observable characteristics or traits, you can say. And this can be applied also to fossils, for instance, because you can compare structures that have preserved different organisms and come up with an idea of how similar or identical or different they are, and see if you can understand if they were belonging to the same species. This is not, as you can imagine, this is a type of concept that can be subjective sometimes, because some people may see more similarities than others in morphology. Okay, you know that the biological species concept is really based on a definition where you cannot boil down to an opinion. Okay, here could be more subjective. The other species concept that we can recognize here is the ecological species concept. I was telling you before about the chichids. These are species of fish that live at different levels in the ocean, just because they feed on that kind of those kind of nutrients or plankton that and zooplankton that's at that level in the ocean. So they all have acquired a niche, and in fact they stay separated. Although they may interbreed potentially, in reality they are ecologically separated. And so we in this case apply the ecological species concept to keep them separated as different species, because in fact they don't really encounter one another very often and reproduce. Okay, so this is known as the ecological species concept. And another concept that we can apply is the phylogenetic species concept. This is more broader, it's a broader concept, and defines a species as a set of organisms representing a specific evolutionary lineage. So it's a broader, really broader group than a species, and mostly is applied to extinct organisms of which we may have fossil record. All right, so in the affinitive we have different types of species concepts that we can apply. The main one, the most used one, and the most scientific one, if we can say, is the biological species concept, which you need to know very well how to recognize and define. But whenever we cannot apply the biological species concept, we can refer to morphological, ecological, or phylogenetic species concept. Sometimes scientists would apply several concepts in order to define a species. Okay, so I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna record the rest of lecture as part 2. Thank you.